Alright guys, so I stumbled across this very interesting video from Dr. Phil in which they are talking about the subject of cultural appropriation. And one of the reasons why I'm doing this video is because Miss Amala, I can't pronounce her last name, from PragerU, is featured on this episode of Dr. Phil, and she does a great job of explaining my position on cultural appropriation, which is that it is a waste of time and that cultural appropriation is actually really a form of cultural appreciation and a sign of cultural dominance when you have other people trying to imitate your culture. That is a sign of power and influence. However, again, the woke revolutionaries don't really understand this because they don't understand cultural dynamics and how culture works. They don't really understand it. So they get mad about something that they should actually be happy about, right? But I want to go ahead and roll this clip from Dr. Phil and this discussion about cultural appropriation and go from there because it is very fascinating.
I want you to take a look at these pictures for me. Anything jump out at you?
Yes. Yeah. They're in costumes.
Right. They're in costumes. These are all celebrities who have been called out, criticized, and condemned for cultural appropriation. Has anyone here ever called someone out for cultural appropriation? You too? You have? You have? Yep. Has anybody here ever thought twice about wearing something or doing something, even cooking something, out of fear of being accused of appropriation?
Yeah, if you are thinking twice about what to wear or what to even cook because you don't want to offend somebody, again, I got questions.
You have?
Yes.
Yeah, what was it?
My daughter had braids and she wanted me to get braids that were just like hers.
Why her but not you?
She's half black and half white.
Okay, so again, according to this woman, right, she can't get braids because she's white, right? Even though her daughter is half black and half white, because she has that half black in her, all of a sudden it's okay for her to have braids. When I'm pretty sure that braids did not originate in Africa. I'm pretty sure that all cultures, ancient cultures specifically, had some form of braiding. I mean, again, I don't necessarily know what the actual origin is, but I've heard of, European style braids like Dutch braids or French braids or whatever. Again, some of that may have some origination in Africa, but I don't believe that people on the African continent, specifically women, were the only people in the world that figured out how to braid hair, right? Or to tie hair in a knot, right? I'm pretty sure they're not the first and only people to figure that out. I'm just saying. So I really don't understand the whole braids thing. I really don't.
Okay.
And so I just think that some things should stick with those cultures.
Well, no matter whether you believe it's harmful or you think people should just be allowed to do what they want, there is no doubt this is a hot button topic.
For no reason, right? For no reason, just because people want something to cry and complain about.
That people are passionate about. Dr. Neil Lester, a professor of English at Arizona State University, right?
I am, yes.
And you've published, lectured, and taught extensively the area of African American studies. What do you think about appropriation? Do you think this is a real thing, something that people need to be cognizant of? And if so, why?
Absolutely. Well, because if we in fact are trying to look at the humanity of other people, and we are trying to live in a place where we are trying to be respectful and mindful of folks, then we need to be aware of things that are important to other cultures that don't necessarily look like us or share the same values. So it is a thing, and people need to be aware of.
Can anybody appropriate?
Anybody can appropriate, yes.
Not just white people?
Absolutely. Appropriation is intersectional. So old people can appropriate youth culture. Youth culture can appropriate old folks. People who are not incarcerated can impersonate, prisoners or those who are incarcerated. Men appropriate women's attire for the sake of funny and mocking. So
Hey, you heard this guy just said? Men appropriate women's attire for the sake of mocking and humor. Does this apply to transgender women, right? Is that what he's talking about? Is he accusing transgender women of appropriating women, right? I'm just saying. I wonder if he would apply that to that situation, because this guy seems pretty woke. I wonder how woke he actually is. But on a serious note, what he's saying here, guys, is that essentially anything can be seen as cultural appropriation. And if anything can be seen as cultural appropriation, then how can you live in a world where you have to keep up with what may or may not offend people based off their perceived culture owning some behavior or practice? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense because cultures have common or shared practices that we all do, right? Because there's certain activities and behaviors that seem to be consistent across human civilization. So again, for us to say that any one behavior belongs to a certain group of people is kind of silly. And it's even more silly to ask people to monitor their everyday behavior to make sure they are not offending people who believe that certain behaviors and practices belong specifically to their culture and their culture only. Again, it's a really silly thing that this guy's proposing here.
Absolutely anybody can do it, and everybody on some level may have flirted with it.
Okay, but a lot of the time that people that I've seen are called out for this, it's not that they were making fun or mocking in some way. It was just that they had adopted a fashion or a style or whatever.
I would say that's a performance. So if somebody's culture and somebody's identity becomes a performance, then it's reductive. So if you're reducing, for example, say the civil rights movement to an afro, and you wear that, or you wear dreadlock wigs, that Rastafarians may wear, you do that because it's edgy, because it's cool, but ultimately because it's not you. And
He sounds like he's describing Kaepernick, right? All these woke revolutionaries who get super woke. Again, people like Colin Kaepernick that wear the fro, right, in the pick. Okay, sounds to me like they're culture appropriating the civil rights movement, according to this guy. Because these guys definitely were not civil rights activists until it became cool to be civil rights activists. And all of a sudden, they started looking like civil rights activists of the 1950s and 60s.
Getting some kind of cultural capital from that by doing it.
And who's hurt by that?
Well, it's not a matter of who's hurt by it, it's who's being disrespected by it.
Well, who's being disrespected by it?
A whole culture of people whose identities are wrapped in whatever you're dressing into and can then take off.
Amala, you don't agree?
I don't, no.
You think worrying about appropriation is a waste of time?
I think not only is it somewhat a waste of time, but it's nearly impossible. You just mentioned there are nearly hundreds of ways that one could appropriate somebody else's culture or their livelihood. And to expect any one human being to keep on top of that throughout their entire life, I think, is an unrealistic ask. And I think imitation is a form of flattery. I appreciate my food by eating it. I appreciate the hair that I wear by wearing it, by putting on the clothes that I wear. And every single item around us in this room could probably be attributed to a certain culture. Do we have to constantly worry about what culture we gain things from?
Does intention have anything to do with it?
Well, I guess I didn't hear anything about anybody worrying about it. What I hear about when I think about and talk about cultural appropriation is people becoming more aware of it. We could say the same thing about racism, sexism, homophobia. Just because you can't solve it and don't see it at every corner doesn't mean we shouldn't be aware of it and trying to address it.
Wow, do you really put those on the same level?
I absolutely
Racism
do.
and sexism,
Absolutely.
you put it on the same level as cultural appropriation?
That's exactly.
So if somebody wears their hair like you're wearing it, you put that on the same level as racism?
Absolutely.
Wow. Again, so to address what Amala was saying here, Amala was basically saying, look, it's a waste of time, which it is. It's totally a waste of time, 100% a waste of time, okay, because there's not any one specific practice that just belongs to one culture and one culture only, right? But also on top of that, again, from a practical perspective, we simply cannot go about life worrying about if we're offending other people based off what they believe belongs to just them and them only, based off whatever culture they claim they belong to. Again, it's actually ridiculous. It's extremely ridiculous. But I think what she said that was the most important is that cultural appropriation is really just cultural appreciation. Nobody cares about this except black people, right? Let's be real. Nobody cares about cultural appropriation except black Americans. And it's really shocking because that's actually a bad thing, because no other cultures care about this stuff. Asians are totally fine with black people wearing their stuff, right? Indians are totally fine with black people wearing their stuff. Arabs are totally fine with black. Like, again, just look at history. Look at the history of what happens when an empire dominates or invades another empire and takes over their empire. What do? One of the first things they do is impose their culture on the other empire. Well, why is that? It's because if you can get people to think like you and to act like you, that is a means of influence, power, and control. Okay? Again, it really blows my mind how these people who are so concerned about power dynamics, right? They're so concerned about white supremacy. Only whites can be racist because they're in power. They don't understand the power dynamics of having people appropriate your culture. It's actually a good thing, right? It's a good thing. Again, everybody else on this planet understands this except black people. Black people are the only group of people that get mad when people appropriate black culture. Latinos don't get upset. White people don't get upset. Asians don't get upset. Arabs don't get upset. Europeans don't get upset. Africans don't get upset. Only black Americans get upset about it. And maybe Native Americans as well too, right? But I don't think the Native Americans are as angry as the media wants to make us believe about all the so-called cultural appropriation. Mainly because they're benefiting from it to a certain extent. But this so-called woke professor here, who should understand this stuff, he would rather be a victim, okay? Because that is what this is. This is, woe is me, another reason to claim victimhood. Somebody's wearing my ugly hairstyle, right? Therefore, that's racism, sexism, is on the same level as that. Absolutely silly stuff.
I put that on the same level as white supremacy, because white supremacy is intersectional. Read Audre Lorde. It's like, and here's what I'm saying. That's why I started by saying this is about humanity or the lack of humanity. When we're putting on someone else's culture, that is somebody else's identity. So when you're talking about being worried about stuff, I'm talking about this in the context of power and history.
You're Brittany, right?
Yes.
Do you?
Yeah. Again, power in history. But he does not seem to understand the power of having people appropriate your culture, in the sense that you gain power and influence over them. Okay? That is how basically any empire gains more control, is through the spreading of culture / religion. It's very simple, right? It's very simple.
You think black people appropriate?
I think it's possible for Black people to appropriate a different culture, just because Black culture is the only culture that exists, and every culture has their own boundaries or things that they find offensive and things they want other cultures to respect.
Yeah, and Black people probably appropriate other people's cultures the most. Chinese tattoos, blonde hair, again, hair that's not even yours, right? And I'm not, obviously, all women do that, but I'm just saying, the people that complain about cultural appropriation the most seem to be the most uncomfortable with being themselves, right? Especially with their own natural looks. Again, it's kind of amazing how that works. It's really amazing how this works.
How many of y'all agree with the doctor here that cultural appropriation is on the same level as racism or sexism? How many of you agree that it's serious like that? How many of you say, no, I think that's overblown? Okay, most of you think that's overblown. Is it they just don't get it?
Well, when we talk about systemic racism, which many of us started talking about after George Floyd's murder, we started seeing the ways in which white supremacy is embedded in everything, and cultural appropriation is about that. It's not only about that, but it is about that. People don't walk into a space and are just raced. You are race and. You're not just raced. So there's race and gender, there's race and religion, there's race and sexuality, there's race and body type. So all of that becomes embedded when we talk about systemic racism. And that's what's missing from conversations about cultural appropriation. We only want to focus on race, but not one person in this room is just raced. That's what I challenge. And that's why age becomes part of this. That's why gender becomes part of this. Dressing up as women and thinking that's funny. That's cultural appropriation. That's
Again, would this guy call a transgender woman a cultural appropriator? Right. Again, I got questions. How far is he going to take this? Because everything he's saying makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. To me, it sounds like, another excuse to cry victimhood. Woe is me. Again, somebody's wearing my ugly hairstyle. Yeah. I'm just saying, guys like this, they make a living being oppressed or putting on the perception that they are oppressed based off some characteristic that they have associated with their skin color, their race, whether or not they like the genitals, who they like sleep with. And it's old, right? It's a very old act. I think most people in that room are listening to this guy and saying this guy is a whack job, right? So let me know what you guys think. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Most importantly, share a Black conservative perspective. Peace.